Greetings, this is Pastor Jared from New Life Presbyterian Church again, coming to you with another installment for our series in which we think about what are maybe some good authors to check out during this time in which many of us have a lot more time to read and we're stuck at home still. What should we do with that time? Instead of perhaps watching that series that we've watched 2 or 3 times on Netflix, or maybe reading the same books or series that we've always had, is there anything that's good for our spiritual development? Anything that would aid in that growth, so that we're not just getting something on Sunday mornings, but that we're able to feed throughout the week? Well, I want to talk to you today a little bit about an author whose name you may be familiar with, Jonathan Edwards. This is the biography of Jonathan Edwards by Marsden. It's a little thick, so I know a lot of you probably wouldn't pick this up as your first introduction to him. But Jonathan Edwards is usually only known for one thing. When you are in history class, they teach you about this fire and brimstone preacher who preached this sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And that's what he became known for during the Great Awakening time of George Whitefield and other preachers who were instrumental in this time of a return to church and people coming to Christian faith who had not been converted before. But perhaps that's all he's known for now. In fact, if you watch the musical Hamilton, Aaron Burr said his grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher, and he's talking about Jonathan Edwards. Well, is that what Jonathan Edwards was? No. Jonathan Edwards, if you had a dominant theme, it wouldn't be fire and brimstone. It wouldn't necessarily even be hell. I think the dominant theme would be joy. This is something I first discovered in the writings of John Piper. If you ever read the book Desiring God, I was introduced to the works of Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards was somebody that was influential for me early on in my Christian life, and I kind of walked away from him for a while, but I've really rediscovered him lately, especially as I've been working through Exodus, and some of the themes have been drawing me back to Edwards and his delight in holiness. Some of the things that he was influential on were things like the religious affections. This was something that he wrote as a series of reflections on the revivals that were going on and what was true in them and what was overblown. There were some excesses in there, people that just got emotional, but there was no real depth to it, a real substance to it. And so he tried to figure out what was true and what was not in what the experience of the Great Revival, of the Great Awakening was all about. If you ever want to explore some of that, where he's trying to figure out what was true conversion and what wasn't, what are evidences that the Holy Spirit is working in, what is just kind of emotionalism. There's a book by McDermott called Seeing God that's really helpful, where he really summarizes what Edwards is saying, but updated language since he was writing in the 1700s and helping us understand what Edwards was getting at. But Edwards then, from that point on, became the premier theologian of the Americas. America never really had a great mind until Jonathan Edwards. In fact, Jonathan Edwards' papers are at Yale. They are still studied today. They still publish them. They still have scholars that are looking into Edwards' philosophical writings as well as his theological writings. He is considered the first really great thinker of America, and he was a theologian and a pastor that did this. There's a few interesting things out there that he wrote that are worth taking a look at. A lot of his writings I've had an introduction to in his works, but you can find smaller little individual works out there, even most of them for free because they're in the public domain. You might want to check out the life of David Brainerd. This was a guy who went off to be a missionary to the Native Americans and was dying of tuberculosis and came back, and he took his papers and his story and wrote it, and he became one of the most influential missionaries, David Brainerd did, because Jonathan Edwards shared his story. Even as far as overseas, John Wesley got a copy of what Jonathan Edwards wrote about David Brainerd, and he published it in England as a spur to English missions, which inspired some people there into missions, perhaps even William Carey. So, what else did he do? He did that. He also wrote on things like the freedom of the will. He wrote quite extensively on this idea of the religious affections. But something else that would be surprising if you only know him from the works of the revival or Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Another work that surprised me was this, where Jonathan Edwards went through 1 Corinthians 13 and preached about love. Of course, the King James translation of love was charity, but Edwards really tried to explain it as this is love. What is love like? And he preached through each of those phrases to help us understand what is love and how does this show us who God is. His final chapter is one that always strikes me, and I've quoted before if you've been paying attention in sermons, and it's a lecture or a sermon that's called Heaven, a Place of Love. That was his definition of heaven, because God is love, and in heaven we would be in the perfect presence of God and his love. So where would you start with Jonathan Edwards? I think The Life of David Brainerd would be a good read, but one that I really like that was really influential in me is one that I took and I had pencil in hand and I marked up and took a lot of notes. And there's a great edition that's out still today, and it's called God's Passion for His Glory. And it's actually taking a work of Jonathan Edwards. And the first half of this book is a guy named John Piper, who's writing an introduction to what he was talking about. And then the last half is seeing Edwards work through it. And his entire goal in what he wrote, and it's not a very long book, but his entire goal in it was to show that God made the world for his glory. And then in explaining that, says that doesn't mean it's not for our good, but his glory is our good. You may see that I'm influenced by that because all the time when I pray that God would answer our prayers for his glory and for our good. Well, I got that from Edwards and from this book, God's Passion for His Glory, that he makes the biblical case that I think is really compelling. So that's what I would recommend. I'd recommend maybe picking up this God's Passion for His Glory, maybe reading through that one sermon, Heaven, a Place of Love, for Edwards' sermons, or maybe reading a little bit about his life. He had a fascinating life. You can definitely borrow the Marsden biography, but if that's a little bit much, I can get you in touch with somewhere else to read. That would be my recommendation. Try to find Jonathan Edwards and to dive into some of the things he wrote, and you'll be challenged. Maybe you'll have to have pen in hand. You'll have to read a little bit more slowly, but it's really worth it. It's gold in the minds of Jonathan Edwards' writings. So that would be my recommendation for this week. Jonathan Edwards, especially in the edition of God's Passion for His Glory. And this has been Jared Nelson, and I hope you have a great week.